Hello everybody, welcome to this special Wednesday seminar, and I'd like to say a big thanks to our Reconciliation Committee who have organised this. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and their elders past and present. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Thomas Meyer to the Institute here today. Thomas is a Zendeth Kes man. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Thomas will correct me if not. From the Northern Territory. He has worked for 16 years in the maritime industry as a port worker and a stevedore, and then becoming the organiser and then elected branch secretary of the Maritime Union of Australia. Thomas has been a long-time advocate for the interests of his fellow nations peoples along with social justice causes. And I'm going to stop there other than to share a couple of other things with you about Thomas. Firstly, I'd like to make a big shout out to his wife back in the Northern Territory. Thomas has 5 kids, ranging from 21 to 4. Is that right, Thomas? That's right. And so on Thomas's journey, which he's going to share with us today, he's been travelling the country, sharing the Uluru Statement, the statement from the heart, with his communities from the 13 regions. So he's been out on the road while his very, very skillful, helpful, thoughtful wife has been at home with those 5 children. So I hope she can feel this love coming from somewhere, that we thank her for doing that. Thomas is going to share with us today the journey that he's been through from that very first regional seminar right the way through taking the Uluru Statement across the country. He's going to share with us today what we can do here, each and every single one of us, to be able to make a difference so that all our Australian peoples can be recognised and can have equality, access to justice, education, and the standard of living that we expect for everybody. Before I hand to Thomas, I just would like to remind us all that we at the Institute publicly supported the Uluru Statement by making a public statement to the Constitutional Committee that was looking at it, and also putting it on our website. Our commitment and passion for reconciliation is a key value that we have here at the organisation, at the Institute, and is something that I hope you will all feel great pride in as we hear from Thomas today. Please join your hands together and welcome Thomas to the stage.
Thank you. I want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, their elders past and present. Zendeth Kes is the Torres Strait, and that's where my father's from. I am born and have always lived on Larrakia land, which is Darwin in the Northern Territory. I will share with you my journey, basically, and I hope that my story will help you understand the importance of the Uluru Statement from the heart and give you the knowledge of what you can do to support it as the most important task that this country has ahead of us, which is to reconcile our dark past and see a better future for all of us. I got involved, well, I'll tell my story from the beginning, I suppose. I was a wharfie from when I was 17-year-old. I loaded and unloaded ships. I did that for 16 years, driving the cranes and all of that stuff. And as a wharfie, there's lots of colourful characters, and I got a bit of an education on politics on the wharf. And most importantly, I learnt the importance of unity. Not just as a word that you beat your chest in at a conference or whatever and say, you know, we need to be united, and then walk away, and that isn't affected to change things for your people. But the structure and the work that is required to act in a unified way. When I was on the wharves, I was there in the 1998 Patrick's dispute. And some of you may not know what happened in 1998, but it was a major dispute around industrial relations where the government colluded with Patrick's and sought to remove the union from the wharves. And they did it. I remember driving to work that morning in April and hearing on the radio that we'd all been sacked and locked out of our jobs. And what they did was they sent in, I think it was mostly ex-SAS soldiers, in the middle of the night on little Zodiac rubber ducky boats and stormed the wharves with balaclavas on, Rottweiler dogs, and physically removed us from our jobs. Now, one thing I'm really proud of as a unionist is our history in supporting social justice struggles. The MUA, my union, was there immediately, without hesitation, when the Gurindji walked off Wave Hill Station and started the longest strike in the country, which was about equal wages and better conditions, and ultimately, in the end, about land rights. There's been plenty of instances of us supporting those sorts of struggles. The apartheid struggle in South Africa, our seafarers, they refused to sail ships that had anything to do with South Africa getting oil. You know, these sorts of things is what our union did to build leverage and to affect change. And so this is my background, and in 2010 I stepped up to be an official of the union. I made the decision to step up and get more involved, and as an official of the union I was able to continue that history, you know, that tradition. I forgot where I was going before. On the Patrick's dispute, all of those social justice struggles that we'd been a part of came back and helped us in the way that the community turned out and supported us, and we overcame that struggle and we kept our jobs. And so this sort of tradition I was able to continue as an official of the union with the support of the members. I attended there was a national day of action, if you remember the WA community closures issue, where Tony Abbott made the comments about it being a lifestyle choice that our people live in the communities in the situation that they're in. And I went to the Darwin Day of Action, and a young woman, Jessie Bonson, organised the day there. She did it in 48 hours. She didn't have a lot of help. There was around 30 of us that turned up there, and I said, well, we need to do more as a union. You know, we need to get more involved and re-engage with the community in this sense. And we did. And the next action in Darwin was the biggest action that we'd had in many, many years. I also organised the response to the disgraceful treatment of youth in Don Dale when Four Corners broke that story. My wife and I were watching it and you know, I mean, like most of Australia, I think, we cried, you know, we had tears in our eyes at the way that these children are being treated. And so we organised that as well. And because of this activism in the community, I was invited to attend a dialogue on constitutional recognition. And for me, I felt like it was good timing because I was searching for something. Having organised those actions in the community, I felt like something was missing from the effectiveness of our advocacy. So I attended it with some hope that this would be an opportunity to find something, big picture, you know, that could reform the root cause of our issues. And I was to be a facilitator. And because I was a facilitator for this dialogue, I attended a trial dialogue in Melbourne. It was at Melbourne University, not far from here, I think. And at that trial dialogue, I learnt that there were to be 12 of these dialogues covering all parts of the country and adjacent islands, that they would be well-informed, 3-day dialogues. There'd be experts on constitutional law and human rights available at each step in those dialogues to answer questions, that there would be 100 participants with a formula applied 60% traditional owners for cultural authority, 20% Indigenous people from Indigenous organisations in the region, and 20% active people in the region, Indigenous people, around political matters and the rest. And to me, when I learnt all of this, I asked mostly elders in that room, it was the co-chairs and facilitators, so it was senior people in those regions. I asked if there had ever been an opportunity like this for our people before. Because for me, as a unionist, always thinking about organising and power building, I saw this as a power building exercise. Here was an opportunity for us to have a collective voice, to have something, a consensus that we could go out and fight for. And the answer from the elders was no, Thomas, there hasn't been an opportunity like this. And especially one where all of these dialogues covering the entire continent would culminate in a sacred place like Uluru. Each of the dialogues elected delegates, and they came together in the heart of the country. I had to pull out of being a facilitator because my national council was to be on the same dates, but fortunately that got moved and I was able to attend as one of the last category, an active person in the region. And I was elected at the Darwin Dialogue to go to Uluru. Now, Uluru was a high-tension meeting. All of the meetings were high tension. What you have to understand is that our people had genocide perpetrated against us. We survived. We've had governments, corporations, outside interests purposely divide our communities, our families. Tactics of division. We weren't just dispossessed of our land, but there were second dispossessions, where in the early 20th century, some of our people were given land to farm, and they'd toiled and sweated and worked really hard and had that land that they'd cultivated, that they were successful in producing a living from, dispossessed again, turfed out onto the streets, threatened that if they were to protest, if they stood up against that, that their children will be taken like so many other families in those days. And so when we come together, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we bring that baggage. Our differences are pronounced because of intergenerational trauma and the desperation that we face in our communities. And so all of that tension, it reached a peak on the second day of the 3-day convention at Uluru. And 20 of the delegates walked out straight into a media scrum. And they said, we weren't heard in there. We didn't have our voice. We weren't given our voice. But they did have their say in there. And the rest of Australia, watching that would have thought, what a mess. Those people that said that we couldn't come to a consensus would have thought that they were right in that moment. But you know what? Those people that walked out, that was their right. We're not homogenous people. Of course there are going to be differences. Of course those with a different view will try and leverage what they can to have their view heard. But what was really important was around 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from all over the country, coming from those dialogues, stayed in the room and continued the deliberations for the rest of that second day. And on the last morning, the third day, they came back together again and they heard the Uluru Statement from the Heart read for the first time. And what happened next is something that I will never ever forget. It's something that drives me to be away from my family, to do this, to build momentum, to see that what the statement calls for is achieved. When the last words were read out by Professor Megan Davis, the entire room stood as one and endorsed the Uluru Statement from the Heart with standing acclamation. Not one person remained seated. There were no calls for amendments. And we all know how difficult it is to draft something with more than yourself, right? Not one person moved an amendment. We stood as one and endorsed the Uluru Statement from the Heart with standing acclamation. And when I looked around the room in that moment, I saw people that had been in passionate debate against one another throughout that process, embracing each other, crying tears of hope and joy. It was just a wonderful moment that is unforgettable. And in fact, when I spoke at the Melbourne University, when I went back there and I was on a panel with constitutional experts, they said that was a constitutional moment. That sounds pretty important to me as a wharfie, you know, but if they reckon it's important, it must be. But what's important about the Uluru Statement? You can see there how amazing this document is. The artwork by Anangu woman Reni Kulitja, the signatures around the statement, all of those people that were there and endorsed it with standing acclamation. We put our names on that blank canvas straight afterwards. The compelling words that you're going to hear, what's really important is that we achieve what it calls for. Now, I'll just read you the Uluru Statement from the Heart now. I think you'll see why it was endorsed in such a way, and then I'll talk about what it calls for. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of their culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That a people's possessed the land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our own destiny, our children will flourish, they will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. That's the Uluru Statement. Now, the Uluru Statement calls for three things. To put it very simply, a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament, truth and treaty. The voice to Parliament, and you've got to remember that in these dialogues also, we learnt about the history of our struggle. Rachel Perkins made a 15-minute film that went from colonisation across all of the aspirational moments that our people have had in the past. This isn't the only statement that our people have put up calling for major reform. There was the Barunga Statement, the Larrakia petition to the Queen, the Yolngu Bark petitions, there was the Day of Mourning. You know, all of these moments where we've called for major reform and they have not been achieved. So we considered all of those things. We also considered the expert panel recommendations, Royal Commission recommendations, all of these other committees and, you know, moments where, you know, these reforms have been put to government and have not been enacted. We considered all of that. We considered the lessons of the past in putting together these proposals. And the voice to Parliament was for us to say that we want to affect the decisions that are made about us before they are made. We want the power, the strength, a voice strong enough to affect those decisions and to self-determine. The expert panel, there were other things that we considered. They proposed a racial non-discrimination clause in the Constitution. I would have loved that. I'm sure many of us would love to see that sort of protection. But it was considered that this had been tried before. It didn't have the political legs. And we also thought, why would we rely on a legal process after a bad decision is made when we can try and affect the decisions made before they are made? In that instance, we would have to wait for the right case. It would go to the High Court. It would take time. It would take money. And we would still be uncertain of the outcome. Ever since ATSIC was abolished by John Howard with the support of Mark Latham, the Labor government, Labor opposition, we haven't had a representative body with that sort of ultimatum resources. ATSIC was another lesson that we learnt. We decided we need to protect the voice. If we build this thing, it must last. And that is the reason why it is a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. We learnt that the Constitution basically is a rule book to the nation. Even the politicians have to adhere to it. Their decisions, yeah, sometimes, Section 44, you know, they try and get away with things, but so we needed to, and also that the Constitution, we were excluded from the Constitution. In 1901, when it was enacted, it came from a process that was white males, not even women, were part of those discussions. No Indigenous people. And in those discussions, they said that they expected Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to go extinct, basically, to die out. But we've survived. And so what we're saying is we understand that this here rule book holds power. And if we build this voice, we must protect it. And we're taking on the harder task of seeing that happen. Legislation will fail us because it's too easily removed or repealed. The truth part of this proposal is in the Makarrata Commission. Makarrata is a Yolngu word for the coming together after a struggle. In all of the dialogues, in every one of them, Our people said, we want the communities that we live in, we want the Australian people to know and understand the truth of our history, what happened to our families, what happened to our clans. That history must be known. And we need the voice. The voice is important to the truth, because you can tell people what the truth is. But unless you are able to negotiate what action's coming out of that, it's less worth, it's worth less for us. So truth-telling was something that all of our people called for all over the country. Treaty making. The Makarrata Commission will supervise a process of agreement making. We didn't use this opportunity at Uluru just to call for treaty. That would be like calling for something that we are already starting to achieve. Victoria here, there has been a process that has been running for more than 2 years now. The representative body is almost set up. That work will complement the national voice. And Jill Gallagher, who has spoken at these halls, is a great supporter of the First Nations voice to Parliament. But we did take the opportunity to put something behind it, to think ahead. The agreement making currently is between a First Nation or First Nations and a state government. But the state government only has so many powers, right? The Commonwealth holds the rest. They hold the majority of the resources. It is really important for the benefit of the treaties that are done locally that we are able to sit at the table with the Commonwealth and negotiate their obligation. Now, what happened next was, after Uluru, immediately Barnaby Joyce came out and said that this was a third chamber to Parliament that we were calling for. And unfortunately, others, Malcolm Turnbull and recently Scott Morrison, have supported that view, which is frankly a lie. I mean, how many times do the people that made this statement, how many times do constitutional experts and the examples of what the amendment could be need to be put to these politicians for them to stop saying what it isn't? I was watching Wick versus Queensland, a documentary about that High Court case many years ago, and I noticed that John Howard used that same rhetoric. It's a tactic of fear and division. They're trying to tell the Australian people, you need to be afraid of what the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are calling for, because they will have a right to veto and block legislation. That is what that is all about. It is not a third chamber to Parliament. It is a voice that strength comes from its representative nature, that it will be First Nations representatives that have the authority to speak on behalf of their people, that will be accountable to their people, and that will be able to come up with a collective decision about our view on legislation and how this country proceeds on those things. So he was wrong about that. I could tell that this was going to be a struggle. We all knew that. And Labor was shaky as well to begin with. And so what I did was I first saw the Uluru Statement from the Heart, this wonderful canvas here, and I was able to travel the country with the support of the MUA, my union, that seconded me to the movement and paid for almost all of my travel and accommodation for more than 12 months. These pictures here that have been running show you some of those travels. I knew that we had to build a people's movement because I didn't have faith in the politicians. Our history shows that. The first place I went to was to see the Gurindji people. It was the Wave Hill Walk-Off anniversary. Every year they have Freedom Day. They celebrate that action that they took in 1967. I think it was 1961 actually, anyway, sorry. And I took the statement there, and the Gurindji people moved a strong resolution of support. They joined their voices with ours. I went to the Pilbara Yule River, a big bush meeting there. And the people there in the Pilbara were having these amazing discussions about setting up a Pilbara voice, a representative voice. And it was easy for me to explain what had happened at Uluru, because I said, you guys are negotiating and building your voice here in the Pilbara to affect decisions that are made here. We also need to do that in the big house in Canberra and be representative there. So that was an amazing meeting to see that going on. I went to, this is Broome, the Native Title Conference earlier this year, and there was also a resolution of support coming out of all those native title holders in Broome. I went to Lumberdina. I've travelled all over the country, non-stop pretty much, all over the country building support for this. And people get it. You get it, right? It's a reasonable proposal. Why wouldn't you give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the First Nations of this country, the ability to affect the decisions that are made about them? It's a pretty simple question. People get it. But in October last year, Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister, dismissed the call for a voice. And he reiterated the third chamber to Parliament thing, but he also said a couple of other things. He said that it wasn't in line with the principles of our democracy, basically. I'm not saying it verbatim, but he was basically saying, why would we create an institution for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people if that's going to lead to the Muslims wanting a voice to Parliament, you know, and so on and so on. And it ignores that our constitution, you know, our democratic structure is built on the former colonies having representative voices that come together in Parliament. The last thing that he said was that the Australian people would not support this. And he's wrong about that. I mean, I've travelled the country and I've spoken not just to progressive people. I've spoken at the Business Council, you know, to insurance companies, all sorts, you know, not just fellow unionists and progressive people. And I know he's wrong for that reason, but there's also polls that have been done that indicate around 60% of Australian people will support this. And that's without political leadership, that's without a resource campaign. We can win a referendum to enshrine a First Nations voice. And so we didn't take no for an answer. We can't take no for an answer. I described the difficulty of those meetings. We poured our hearts and souls into that document. The other documents that I talked about, they didn't achieve what they called for. Bob Hawke promised treaty out of the Barunga Statement. Those hopes were dashed on the rocks of political expediency. This time, we will keep fighting for it. I want to thank the Institute for the contribution that you've made to this struggle. You guys made that submission to the Joint Select Committee. And it's not all doom and gloom. What we learn in the union movement is we have to celebrate our wins. And this struggle, the momentum that we built, your submission made a difference. The Joint Select Committee's interim report came out in late July. And that interim report acknowledged that the Uluru process was good, you know, it was a good process, acknowledged that it was the collective decision-making, it was self-determination, and it also focused then, for the remainder of its work, on the voice. Now that's a win. And so I really want to thank the Institute for your contribution. Now the Joint Select Committee is working towards its final report. On the 30th of November, it's due. And we need to continue to influence them. Our work is not done. I hope that you guys can take some actions, and I'll suggest a few actions now. You can keep in the ear of your local representatives and your federal representatives. Write to them. Write to the members of the committee, it's not too late, or to the Joint Select Committee, even though the timing for submissions have closed. Write to them. Simple email saying, you know, we still think that the voice should be enacted. Join us on this latest battleground. Those that do support in Parliament are starting to say we want to legislate this first. It was Father Frank Brennan had an article out recently, and I have to disagree with that view of legislating first. We called for a constitutionally enshrined voice for a very good reason, as I explained. If we legislate this, it will already exist. The momentum will not be there to take this to a referendum. We're saying, let's keep the momentum going, put the question to the people, enshrine the First Nations voice. Then there should be a First Nations-led process to design the body, the voice that comes out of it. Now, some people argue, well, that's not enough detail for us to say yes to such a question, but it's a simple question. What more detail do you need? Why shouldn't we have a voice? Why shouldn't that be a principle in our Constitution with the legislation that comes after? Constitutional law is done this way around the country. This is around the world. It's what I learned from the constitutional experts. They're saying this, that you do not have too much detail at the front end of a referendum, because that just gives too much opportunity for a no case and it becomes too confusing and it doesn't succeed. This makes sense, doesn't it? Don't have to be a constitutional expert to understand that. So if you do write to the politicians and the federal members and all the rest, please tell them that you'll support a referendum and that that is the most urgent task of this country right now, that we answer that question as a people. You can talk to your local councils, get in the area as well. Councils were a major factor in the same-sex marriage debate. You know, as the councils came on board and, you know, I mean, that really helped. Social media is really important. Hashtag Uluru Statement. Say that you support this. All of these little things all add up and they'll help us. So please join the campaign. Thank you for listening. And please go to the website that was up there before, is on those papers, www.onevoiceuluru.org. Register your support. One of the actions that were up there was a action in Wentworth, Malcolm Turnbull's electorate. It was on the anniversary of the Uluru Statement. We gathered a whole heap of supporters in the electorate, and I asked them all after a couple of speeches. We had the Gurindji people with us, 3 of those guys, including Vincent Lingyari's granddaughter. They made speeches. And I said to the crowd, please go out from this today. I gave them all highlighted bits of the streets and all that sort of stuff. And I said, go and have as many respectful discussions as possible with voters in Wentworth and let them know what Malcolm Turnbull has done. And so we're going to have more actions like that. So if you register on the website, you'll know when we're doing that and you can join us. Thank you. Happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Thomas. That was amazing. And your rendition of the Uluru Statement from the Heart was very inspirational and moving. We all really enjoyed your speech. Would anybody like to take a moment to ask any questions? Andrew.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it sounds like a no-brainer to me, but I would have thought that about you know, gay marriage or climate change. It seems to me that the Australian people are actually more progressive than the government actually is. And perhaps in recent times, in the last 10 years or so, small factions of the government seem to hold the rest of the government to ransom. And I wonder whether So there's optimism that, you know, we've got some of these things through, so I'm sure the Uluru Statement will go through. But I just wonder whether in mainstream media and in these factions that seem to hold a lot of power, is it possible to get there?
Yeah, it's a really good question and statement. I'm not sure that we're going to achieve the Uluru Statement, though, not without your support. And I guess that goes to the point. I mean, it calls for a constitutionally enshrined voice. We're going to need a double majority. I'm not naive enough, please understand, I'm not naive enough to think that this is an easy task. And that's not really answering your question, but I like Q&A because I get to pick up things that I miss. It's a huge task, and so I hope that we're going to achieve it. I know we can, but it's going to require you guys to do things. I don't think any actions are too small to make a difference. And I think that answers the question, though. We are more progressive than the politicians. You know, we are certainly more progressive than the government today. No doubt about that. Same-sex marriage, you know, that outcome of the plebiscite indicates that. You know, we were way ahead of the politicians. They should have just did it. They shouldn't have put people through what they had to go through, you know, that community through that shouldn't have happened. They should have just enacted it. It was obvious that a majority of Australians would support that change. Laura Tingle wrote an article recently, Follow the Leader, you know, and in it she talks about, I really liked it in the sense that it talked about what our obligation is as followers, right? If we're not holding these politicians to account, then they're going to continue to not act on what the majority's view is. And it has to be outside of the election cycle. It's got to be with actions like when we visited Wentworth and we knocked on the doors of his constituents and had respectful conversations that tried to influence their vote at the next election. He's gone now, fortunately. We've got an interim Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, but we might knock on his door pretty soon. But I hope that answers your question, Andrew. Thank you.
Jerry.
Do you have a particular plan for how the voice would be, so to speak, assembled? I mean, how would this democratic voting, or would elders have a particular role? Or?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, design issues were fleshed out. There is, on the Referendum Council, part of their report included a design issues paper. We had 3 days at Uluru, and I talked about what a dynamic meeting it was. We didn't have time to agree on the whole design of the whole thing. But the statement calls for a representative voice. That is really important. And as you can probably understand, there's different forces in action now. The voice was, they tried to get rid of the Uluru Statement. They didn't succeed at that. Now you've got different interests saying, well, this is how it should be designed, and non-Indigenous people are saying, well, this is how it should be designed. But what we're advocating for is a process that is led by First Nations, similar to the dialogue process that proved to be successful, that from the grassroots, they can say how they want to be represented. That is really, really important for this. If it is not driven by those communities, it will fail, in my view. They must, and it'll be in different ways as well. It's a good question because I'll point out also, in some places they might say, so it sort of depends on the impact of colonisation. So where culture is very much intact and those ancient structures are still intact, they may not need a ballot process to decide who their representative is. They may say, well, we understand who our most senior DLAC is. Whereas, around here, it may be, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here, but it might be a ballot run by the Electoral Commission. But those decisions should be made by the First Nations themselves, in our view.
Suzanne.
So I understand why you want to go to a referendum first, because it will enshrine a principle. But it does seem to me that we will need some kind of statement about what the voice is in order to be able to get people to vote one way or the other. So what's the simplest kind of statement you imagine it might be, the question that we would be asked?
You are absolutely right. There is a balance of detail that is needed. I talked about, the constitutional reform process. There's always a balance that's needed. You can't have no detail at all. So what Professor Megan Davis and Professor Pat Anderson and Noel Pearson and Delassa Yorkston, those Indigenous members of the Referendum Council have been doing recently is they're going to have a late submission to the Joint Select Committee that puts a proposal about that balance. And if you register on the website, I'll easily be able to communicate on how to support that submission. But basically, the constitutional experts that they work with as well have been putting together the question, and then a set of legislation that will be enacted before the referendum that gives that detail about the process to follow. And all of that, they've done it really smartly, has drawn from the dialogues and the Uluru Convention to make sure that even that draft legislation and the whole proposal sort of comes from what the people have said. So we are going to address that and try and get to that balance. Yeah.
Len.
I have a similar comment. So most of us are sitting in this room, I guess, because we've arrived at a moral position about this, and or that we appreciate, your culture and what it is and how important it is for this country. But when you go out there to a referendum, people in the grey zone who, the average punter, will want to know what's in it for me. Why should I do this? So I just want to make a comment that from where I stand, it seems to me that you need to come up with some sort of message as well. And it's probably about how important the culture is. But you need to translate that in a way that people will understand that sort of reasoning. You can't expect everybody to have a moral position or a philosophical position.
Yes, I agree with you, and that will be developed. We already obviously know the answers to those questions, such as there's a massive amount of money spent in Indigenous affairs that is basically going into other pockets other than those communities that could, we have failed programs, all of these things, and this can be done better. There is the culture, this gift that the Uluru Statement talks about, which is, a culture that is 60,000 years old, and that is something that we can embrace with reform, including our voices in the Constitution. All of these things will need to be put out, very intelligently, and strategically. At the moment, this has been a campaign without resources. Like I said, the union's paid a comrade's salary to help me in my branch because I'm the elected official in the Northern Territory still. There's a loose coalition of our people that are driving this along and getting what momentum we can. And when we go to referendum, there will be much more resources. There's already a lot of offers from the business community, other unions and all that to contribute. So we will get much better at that messaging. And I think your question is partly because that's not really there right now, and a lot of people haven't even heard of the Uluru Statement. But we will get there, yes.
One last question.
It's quite obvious that the current government is not very supportive of you and the amendment, but do you have any sense of how the current opposition or Labour government is in other political parties and what will happen if they get voted in? Because I think it's always easy while you're in the opposition to support something, but then will they be really supportive when should they be voted in?
Yeah, my great fear is, you don't count your chickens before they've hatched, but I think Labor will win the next election. And my great fear is that they will continue down the easy path. You know, it's human nature. You know, you pick the easiest path, tick a box, and off you go. But they are avoiding committing to a referendum on a First Nations voice. If you read their political speak, it's we support the Uluru Statement from the Heart and a voice to Parliament, and we support constitutional recognition. They are separating the two. It can't be separated because you can't deliver on the Uluru Statement without the referendum, and legislation at the front end will fail. It'll fail us. We'll never see a referendum on voice. So I do hope anyone with affiliations with Labor will knock on their door as well and let them know, but that is my greatest fear as far as Labor's position goes.
We'll make sure Doug Hilton knows that next time he speaks to Bill Shorten.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for coming along today. Australia is still one of the few Commonwealth nations that doesn't have a treaty with its Indigenous people. I just wanted to use the last few seconds just to read a few lines from our submission that we made from the Institute. We believe that all people in our communities should benefit from the great things that our country has to offer, including equality of access and outcome in health and education, and that every person should have a say in decisions that directly affect them. It is in this spirit that we stand with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the quest to establish a First Nations voice to Parliament, enshrined in the Constitution and as outlined in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We also support the formation of a Makarrata Commission to further strengthen the process of reconciliation in this country. Many lines of evidence tell us that health is closely linked to social, economical, cultural and historical factors. And this will permeate our efforts at all levels to improve the health of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. That's what the Institute publicly stated, and that's what we still stand for. So thank you, Thomas.
Got about 16 of these, and I just want to say I'm sorry I couldn't bring the original statement to you guys. I travelled with it, you know, for more than 12 months, and we've decided it needs to rest and be looked after. You know, it's just so precious, and I've left it in a hotel lobby once. Fortunately, I always stay at the same place in Sydney, and I was walking out to dinner, and the receptionist said, "Hey, did you forget something, Thomas?" And I said, "No, I was in a hurry, you know." And she said, "What about that long tube thing that you carry around all the time?" Yeah, it was a Uluru Statement. It's gone on the wrong plane and all that, so we've decided it better, and it's starting to fray a little bit and everything, so... but yeah, I mean, I wish I could have brought it here. These extra canvases I've carried with me everywhere I've been. There's about 16 of these big canvases, chock-a-block full of thousands of signatures. You're welcome to sign it on your way out. I might even leave it here if you like, and maybe you guys can get the signatures later if people have to rush off to do science stuff. So, yeah, you're welcome to put your name on it. These are going to rest with the Uluru Statement, so it's your chance to be a part of it. Thank you.